Now, I hope you brought your thinking cap with you, maybe your learning cap, because today we're going to go over some of the most misunderstood terms in painting and decorating. If you use terms like tint, tone, shade, or my personal favorite, complementary, because I love them compliments, y'all, then you want to make sure that you're using these terms correctly. I'm James from thepaintpeople.com, and welcome to Paint School. And these are the 6 design terms that you may be screwing up. I'm not pulling any punches here, y'all. Let's call this video the Paint Peoplepedia for painting and decorating, I guess. Hit the like button to get started, and also a large thank you to our friends over at Mighty Boards for helping us out with today's video, but more on them later on. Now, I'm sure there are a lot of you that have heard all these words before, but I wanted to make sure that we're all on the same page as to what is trying to be communicated when they're being used. The first one is neutral. Now, for all my Paint People subscribers watching, you've heard me use this word before. Neutral. Neutral colors, neutral palette. And if it's your first Paint People video, then welcome. But much like a lot of the terminology we're going to go over today, this is one that has a few different accepted meanings. I can almost guarantee that a lot of you will equate neutral colors to those muted colors that are maybe a bit undersaturated and subtle. Colors like classic gray and alabaster, or even darker colors like Revere Pewter. Most of you will accept these as neutral colors because they don't really present extremely strong, vibrant color hues. But what if I told you that Caliente, Hail Navy, and Salamander are also neutral colors, or at least they can be in certain situations. And no, I'm not yanking your colorful chain here. This is because in the world of design specifically, and this is important, any color can be deemed as neutral, as long as it's the main or the predominant color in the space. The dominant color in a room is technically considered neutral, and this is regardless of how soft, muted, or bright and bold the color is. But there is also an understanding of what most people deem as neutral, and those are the colors that aren't very polarizing, and they're just a little more understated in their color. So here we're sort of separating the technical definition of neutral colors versus colors that portray a neutral or a passive vibe. But I think it's important to make that distinction to people, so there's an overall awareness that just because someone says the neutral color of the palette, that doesn't necessarily mean they're talking about something like this. Pretty fun fact, right? Next, let's talk about tint, or tints. This one is very personal to me because prior to working as a color consultant and a YouTube personality, I used to work at a paint store where I would mix paint, or as I used to say, tint paint, which would usually mean adding colorant to a white base of paint to create a paint color. That's how we do it. If you've ever dyed your hair, for example, they actually use tint or artificial dye to color the hair. And you might think that it's the same thing with consumer grade paint, and that's where things get a little confusing. What I was doing was mixing up tint with colorant, because colorant is what we would use to mix the paint to your desired color. But in the color terminologies world, a tint is when you take a pure color hue and add white to that to make it lighter or creamy looking. So it's actually the exact opposite of what I was doing at the paint store. So whenever you hear someone say, oh, that color is a tint of red, they're probably talking about a lighter creamy red that has had white added into it to make it pink, for example. So no, the person at the paint store is not tinting a can of paint technically. They're just mixing it. No need to complicate things any more than they need to be. So while we're talking about tints, we can quickly touch on the other 2 color variations that go alongside it, shades and tones. These are terms that are sometimes used a little ambiguously or vaguely or incorrectly. So I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page as to what they mean by definition. A shade is a little more obvious and clear to me because it really just ends up being the opposite of a tint, where you start with a pure color and then you add black to it to make it darker. That's creating a shade. An easy way to remember this is if you want a shade of green, just take a green color and put it in the shade. Or you could also say that navy blue is just a shade of blue. So just don't make a mistake of thinking that all the different shades of a color are in fact all shades, because they're not. It's just the darker variations that contain black that are noticeably darker. Those are the shades. Can you see where I'm getting at? I know it's a bit much, but we're getting there. The other color variation we need to talk about are tones. And I know there are a lot of people that will say, that's a nice tone of red, without really knowing what a tone is technically. A tone is what sits between a tint and a shade, but instead of having white or black in it, it's a pure color that has gray added in. So you can kind of think of it as a combination of the two. This one is a little trickier to perceive because it does sit in the middle, but more often than not, a tone of any color will look a little more soft and how I like to call dusty. And I'm sure a lot of you watching will also call it neutral. See what I did there? A tone of yellow is a more muted version of yellow because it contains gray. You don't want to mix up tones with undertones as well, which a lot of people do. And it's totally fine if you do, by the way. I'm not holding anything against you. But I know that some of you want to take this stuff a little more seriously, so these are the terms. Next up, we have another word that starts with T, one that I'm sure we all know the definition of, but we don't necessarily know the proper execution of. And of course, we're talking about testing. Whenever you're debating a paint color for your home or whatever, you can really avoid a costly mistake by properly testing your colors out. Keyword, properly. Properly. I know many of you are familiar with little paint swatches like this, and I'm sure a lot of you have thought that this is how you test a color out. But our favorite way to test paint colors out on this channel is to use a mighty board. Mighty boards are massive paintable surfaces that are flexible and maneuverable. You simply paint your board with whatever color you're thinking of using. That way you have more surface area to work with, and you also have a testing surface that you can move to different parts of the same room or to different rooms altogether. Gone are the days of covering your walls with random brush strokes of all kinds of different paints, or hurting your eyes staring at tiny little swatches like this. There is testing your paint colors, and then there's testing your paint colors mightily, the right way. I'll leave Mighty Boards' information in the description down below if you want to pick some up yourself. So now that you're familiar with some important color terms, I wanted to finish off with two of the most misunderstood color scheme or color palette terms. These both have to do with color palettes or color schemes, so let's first talk about monochromatic color schemes. How many of you think that a monochromatic color scheme is black and white or grayscale? You're technically right, but what if I told you that this is a monochromatic color scheme as well? Ooh, crazy, huh? This is really colorful, but if you'll notice, there's only one real color hue present, although there are various tints, tones, and shades of that same color hue coming together. It almost seems like we've come full circle in this conversation. So yeah, monochromatic color schemes can involve a lot of color as long as it's one color. There's still room to play with different levels of depth of saturation and intensity. So while your exclusively gray room is technically monochromatic, you can be just as monochromatic with the reddest of rooms as well. Finally, let's get to my most favorite misunderstood color term. And I'm honestly not surprised how often it is misused. I'm talking about the term complementary. First of all, I believe it's called homophone or a homophone. Thank you, English class. So first you have to figure out which spelling you want to use. Are you hoping that your paint color is complementary to your couch? Or are you hoping that your guests will be very complimentary of your accent ceiling? In terms of color theory, complementary colors don't really have anything to do with warm fuzzies, but strictly it refers to colors that sit on opposite ends of the color wheel. So for example, we have the Christmas colors, green and red. Those are complementary. That's what complementary colors are at their purest form. Now you could have variations of complementary colors like split complementary or triadic colors, but I'll leave that to our color palette video because I explained all about that, which you can watch after this one. But really, if someone asks you what color will complement my green pillows, your response should be, well, some red carpet, of course. Now, just like the use of the term neutral, complementary with an E sort of has two uses or understandings, and that's because of the word itself. Outside of the world of color, complementary just means two or more parts that come together to make a better whole. So that can mean a bunch of different things. A dark brown chair on a light brown floor can still look amazing and therefore be complementary of one another, but they're not complementary in the color theory sense of the word. How many of you have used some of these terms without fully understanding their color theory definitions? I know I've done it in the past, so I'm very curious to hear about your experiences. At the end of the day, it's really not a massive deal, but at least now you know, so you can not confuse your interior decorating friends quite as much. This is our video on color palettes, so if you want more information on the different types of complementary color schemes, I'll tell you all about it right over here.